Dr. Francesca Alesse on Socrates' double notion of nomos in Plato's Crito.
Thank you very much, Don, for inviting me. Thank you all for participating. And I begin now. Sorry, I apologize for my delay for problems of connections. My paper focuses on two meanings of law that can be drawn from the Crito. I shall attempt to show that from the dialogue between Socrates and Crito, and from the dialogue between Socrates and the laws, the speech of the laws, two meanings of nomos can be obtained. One more explicit and evident, the other less visible, but just as important. My purpose is to derive from the Crito, at least to a certain extent, the opinion of the historical Socrates about legal authority, and at the same time, some elements of reflection that prepare the way for the Platonic critique of the written law, such as it is developed in the Politicos. In its more evident meaning, nomos is the foundation of the social and political body, and seems to be nearly identical with the polis. Whatever the normative content, which can vary from state to state, the law exists in order to regulate the life of citizens. This meaning can be drawn above all indirectly from the speech of the laws, whose arguments against disobedience and Socrates' flight can be arranged as follows. The laws consider themselves as the nurses or tutors, trophies of Socrates and any other citizen, as they represent the foundation of marriage and of the constitution of family, the education of children, i.e. those institutions without which the social body would collapse. In addition, the laws regard Socrates' flight as their own and the whole city's destruction, as the text of 58.5b1 says, Nomus emas apolesai kai sympasan ten polin. For the existence of the laws is founded on the application of all its decrees, including court verdicts. I quote, do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its court have no force but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals? Ask rhetorically the laws at 50b25, where group as private individuals translate the Greek upo idioton akuroi, a very strong stress on the lack of institutional role of people in front of the nomoi. Finally, Socrates has never questioned this role of guarantee played by the laws, as is shown by the fact that he never left Athens. That is, Socrates has always given proof of agreement, of homologia with this role. He cannot therefore give up on this agreement at the end of his rather long life. Obedience to the laws is therefore based on both social and legal grounds, the survival of the community and respect of lawfulness. A similar set of ideas, albeit founded on different grounds, can also be drawn from the dialogue between Socrates and Crito. Socrates rejects Crito's proposal because flight, though apparently justified by the fact that he has been wronged in court, would amount to doing evil, kakurgein, which, at least in Socrates' language in this dialogue, is identical with adikein, that is, wrongdoing, acting wrongfully or acting unjustly. This is what we read in section 49a, 50a, with particular reference to the exchange of words in 49b10 to c10, where Socrates assimilates adikein and kakurgein, as well as antadikein and anti-kakurgein, and both with kakos poiein. The well-known Socratic principle whereby one must never harm anyone, not even one's enemies, according to the traditional ethics, and not even in order to inflict harm in return or to retaliate, implies that Socrates must not do anything contrary to the laws of Athens, not even in the case he has been condemned unjustly. It is unclear to me whether Socrates really thinks that he must also obey the laws because they are his nurses or parents. Nonetheless, he claims, just as Crito does, that obedience to the laws is a case of application and observance of the principle that we should never harm other people, not even in order to anti-decay. Socrates, therefore, in arguing that he cannot escape because flight is an evil caused to the laws, that is, to the community, seems to agree, at least in general terms, that law in force is the cohesive foundation of a state. In addition to this, it seems to me there emerges in the Crito a second meaning of nomos. According to this second meaning, the law is a logic and linguistic, i.e. a communicative structure, as it communicates something whose truth can be accepted or disputed. Hence, the law is quite similar to a subjective opinion, individual opinion, because like any opinion, it too is a logos, more specifically a discourse stating what should and should not be done. That the law is a logos analogous to an opinion can be inferred from the themes of both agreement, homologia, and persuasion, whose importance is stressed throughout the dialogue, as we shall see. Both agreement and persuasion presuppose two essential moments of the Socratic notion of conversation, as this is provided especially by Plato. The moment of exitazein, the examination of the plausibility of an opinion, and that of elenkos or ilenkos, the refutation of the weaknesses of an opinion. It is worth saying a few words on the meaning of the verb exitazein and the term ilenkos in Plato's portrait of Socrates, although neither of these two terms appear in the Crito. In this dialogue, however, we find the frequent use of the notion of skepsis, also by the verbs skeptomai or skopein, a notion which, if not perhaps interchangeable with exitazein, nevertheless recalls the sense of investigation and research, especially research carried out in common through dialogue and interlocution. On the other hand, the presence of the verb exitazein is very relevant in the text that, from a dramatic as well as chronological point of view, is very close to the Crito, i.e. the Apology. Here, the exitazein is described as the hallmark of the Socratic conversation, to the point that it was imitated by the young aristocrats who, in this way, damaged the philosopher's reputation. It is also the inquisitive practice that Socrates himself adopts in analyzing the accusation of Miletus point by point, and hekaston exetazomen, says Socrates in Apology 24 CE. But the most telling sense of the verb exetazein appears in Apology 28e, where Socrates says that the god himself, presumably the inner daimon, ordered him to live by philosophizing and examining, I quote, tuteu tatontos os philosophum tameodein zen kai exetazonta emauton kai tus allus. The identity of life, philosophy, examination, the latter addressed to oneself as well as to others, is presented as a divine command. In the Apology 29e, the ilenkos is described as one of the two results of the exetazein. It is the refutation of the opinion that did not stand the examination, whereas homologia is rather the consensus reached only after the exetazein and the ilenkos have been applied to a given belief. The double Socratic strategy of examining a given opinion and reaching homologia is fundamental for the construction of a very complex argument, because examination and agreement, step by step, provide the criterion of logical coherence. This is what can be seen, for instance, in Protagoras 350e or 360a, in which the verb homologein is used by Socrates to indicate the consent obtained by the interlocutor on a given proposition, which then may be assumed as a premise for a subsequent argument. This meaning of homologia as argumentative coherence also recurs in the Crito, together with other meanings of this notion. Indeed, as we shall see by analyzing the speech of the laws, homologia can be established and sanctioned without being arrived at by these two critical operations of exetazein and elenchos. The same notion of homologia can be understood as consent to a principle of authority and coincide with obedience to laws without this being subjected to any critical examination. In this case, i.e. when we deal with a consensus that is not obtained as a consequence of examination, it is plausible to think that we are not faced with the historical Socrates' point of view, which is instead expressed by the idea of life as a life devoted to the exetazein, which is the same as a philosophical life. Before expounding some more details the arguments in favor of my view on the double meaning of nomos, I shall rapidly recall some of the main interpretative problems raised by the Crito, without pretending to be exhaustive and only as regards the notion or notions of authority. Discussion of the Crito have mostly focused on the following points about authority. First, the apparent inconsistency with the apology because of Socrates' different attitude toward political authority and the laws on the one hand, and his own conscience and demonic authority on the other. Second, the coexistence of the principle whereby the practical norm that should be followed is not the opinion of the people, but the judgment of experts, and the idea that everyone should attempt to arrive at the best argument by making use of reason, either on their own or in a dialogue with other people morally committed to examining their own views. Socrates defends both principles in the first part of the Crito, as we can see in 46b 5.6, where he insists on following his own reason, moi logizomeno, and in 47d, where Socrates underlines the competent people's opinion. Then the importance of these principles, the value of expert opinion and the autonomy in arriving at the best argument, as opposed to the speech of the laws, which reminds Socrates of his apparent adherence to the principle of absolute obedience. Finally, the legalistic authoritarian model, although not fully authoritarianism, as claimed David Bostock, that Socrates might be thought to defend, an anti-democratic perspective that might also seem to be at odds with his view that the rules of conduct should be autonomously determined. My impression, my provisional impression, is that some of these problems, or all of them, cannot find a solution due to the fact that the Crito is a deliberately aphoretic and problematic dialogue. I believe that this dialogue was written by Plato with the aim of highlighting the contradiction between Socrates and only Socrates, not necessarily any other citizen, and the law in force. A contradiction that is resolved only with the disappearance of one of the two terms. The Crito can hardly be appreciated in the light of the consistency of content with other dialogues or in the light of contemporary theories about the legitimacy of authority. To support my claim, I shall attempt to show that there is a correspondence linking the dialogue between Socrates and Crito and that between the laws and Socrates. By correspondence, I mean the occurrence of some issues in both parts of the dialogue, of which these issues constitute the conceptual basis. However, there are some significant differences in the way these themes, these issues, are presented in Socrates' dialogue with Crito and in the speech of the laws. The first issue is what I would call the alternative obedience persuasion, two concepts both expressed by the verb peito, peitomai. It is a formal disjunctive structure opposing two interlocutors, either real or ideal, each of whom is committed to giving up their view and adopting their opponents if they find themselves to have been persuaded by their arguments. This alternative is important from both a logical linguistic and a practical perspective. At a logical linguistic level, at least in one case, the alternative takes the form of a contradiction. I am thinking of 49 BE, where Socrates distinguishes two categories of people: those who, like himself and Crito, hold that we should never do wrong in any way to anyone, and those, the majority, who think that in some cases we are allowed to harm some people, i.e., someone who has offended us. In the first instance, Socrates formulates a universal negative proposition. In the second, a particular affirmative one. The practical and political consequence of this contradiction is very serious, for between these two fronts, no common deliberation is possible, as Socrates claims at 49b3, no koine boule, thereby pointing to the fact that a common ground is needed if dialogue is to take place. In my view, the contradictory form that emerges in this stage of the dialogue between Socrates and Crito hints at the unfortunate end of Socrates, for it is clear that the laws support not Socrates' view, but a common view that it is permitted to harm some people sometimes. For this reason, too, the coexistence between Socrates and Athens, if none is being persuaded by the other, becomes impossible. More generally, and aside from radical consequences, in the disjunctive structure, obedience, persuasion, each interlocutor is committed to giving up their own view and adopting their opponents if they feel convinced by their arguments. In the dialogue between Socrates and Crito, Socrates emphasizes this aspect, the giving up of a view that has been proved wrong through reasoning and refutation. At 46c2-3, he maintains that if Crito, through his dialogue with Socrates, fails to provide a better argument, i.e., better than the one Socrates might have developed on his own against the view that he should flee, then Socrates will not accede to Crito's request that he flees from Athens. At 46d7, Socrates wants to discuss again with Crito a principle that in the past had seemed to be right, i.e., that we should give in not to the opinion of anyone or the multitude, but to that of the best. If this view is still valid, we should obey it, peisometa auto. If not, we should bid it farewell, easomen kairein. What is interesting here is the language Socrates uses to describe the attitude we should have towards a view that has turned out to be false or has not resisted elenkos. We shall bid it farewell, let it go. This kind of language does not only refer to our knowledge that a certain opinion is true or false, it hints at the practical attitude. Even if in this case we cannot reconstruct a contradiction, we are faced with a situation where one side of the alternative must give in. Such is the case at 48 D8 E1 2. While urging Crito to stick to the principle long agreed upon that we should never act wrongfully, Socrates reverts to the disjunctive form. If Crito persuades Socrates, Socrates will obey, so he pays and flee. If he fails to persuade Socrates, he must, I quote, stop repeating the same arguments, 48 E1-3. Pausa iede o macarie, pollakis moi legon ton auton logon, i.e., Crito must keep silent. The image of keeping silent corresponds to bidding farewell, an opinion that cannot persuade the interlocutor, that is unable to account for itself, to perform the task of logon didonei, should not remain, should, so to speak, disappear. This alternative emerges again in the speech of the laws. They point out that Socrates can either persuade or obey them. See, for instance, 51 BC, 52 AB. Yet this correspondence is not perfect and carries through considerable discrepancies. First, it is unclear what it means, leaving metaphors aside, that the law can be persuaded as if it were a human being who can change their mind. I'll come back to this point at the end of my talk. Second, in addition to the alternative, either you persuade or you obey, the laws propose a third option, that of leaving the city. Either you persuade us or you leave Athens. Leaving is yet another version of the disappearance of the losing and succumbing opinion, and can be compared to the image of an opinion we bid farewell to or fall silent about. From a logical point of view, then, the third option, i.e. leaving the city, is not a new possibility with regard to the alternative, either you persuade or you obey, but it is from a practical and moral point of view, for it cannot be equated with obedience, although obedience too translates into practical terms the fall of the losing opinion. Apparently, in the dialogues between Socrates and his friends, this third practical option is absent. It seems to me that Socrates never asks an interlocutor who happens to be not entirely persuaded to leave the conversation. He even threatens to leave a meeting himself because he is not allowed to converse through short questions and answers, even though in the end he remains. I am obviously referring to Protagoras, 334c and following. In Socrates' perspective, in private dialogues, opinions succumb, but interlocutors remain. They may change their mind and start a fresh discussion and inquiry. Another important issue in the Crito is homologia, which is dealt with in a number of ways, both in the first and the second part of the dialogue. Homologia is retaining one's convictions over time if these convictions are not modified by elenchos. But at the same time, it is the simultaneous agreement of many people, or at least two people, examining their own opinions. Finally, homologia is also consistency between thinking and acting. These three senses of homologia are clear in the dialogue between Socrates and Crito. Somehow they re-emerge in the speech of the laws, when the latter urges Socrates to abide by the principle they and he have long agreed upon, and to look to this principle as a guide for action. However, in this case too, there is a significant discrepancy. In the dialogue between Socrates and Crito, homologia between different people about a certain conviction is the product of the examination whose aim is to spot the weaknesses of an opinion and let the best argument emerge. Such an examination should be performed in common, as we read in Crito 46d5, I quote, I wish to investigate Crito in common with you, koine metasu. Also in 48, Idee, let us, my good friend, investigate in common, scopomen koine. The idea of episkepsis koine, which is crucial in Socrates' view of the dialogue, is absent from the speech of the laws. That there is homologia between the laws and Socrates, and that it has arisen and grown stronger over time, can only be inferred from the fact that Socrates has always lived in Athens, has never questioned its laws on marriage and education, has never considered leaving the city. Such homologia between a citizen and the state where he was born is sanctioned, so to speak, a silentio, as it has never been questioned, and therefore it is not the outcome of Ilenkos. That there has been no examination of the content of the laws, as there has been for the opinions of Socrates' interlocutors, can be inferred, among other things, from the laws repeatedly urging Socrates to persuade them, as we see in 51b, 34, 51c1. This could mean, whether rightly or wrongly, that Socrates has never performed an analysis of the laws, of either some of them, or the whole normative system, or the general concept of nomos. This is why the lack of refutation translates into tacit adherence to the laws, to both their prescriptive content and their coercive character. This enables us to see what is missing in the political experience of homologia as it is depicted in the speech of the laws, compared to the experience of homologia as it is lived in the Socratic dialogue. The laws too regard homologia as adherence to principles unchanged over time, which are shared by different people and put into practice. But it is sanctioned by Socrates' acquiescence. When put into practice, then, this kind of homologia turns into almost unconditional obedience, for the citizen has developed no argument against any given content on the law, and if citizens do not obey, they are legally guilty. The third key element of the overall structure of the Crito is the view that we should not inflict harm in return, we should not anti-decaying. Rejection of anti-decaying is present in both parts of the dialogue, yet with a fundamental difference that, as we have seen, gives rise to a contradiction between the opinion defended by Socrates and that supported by the laws. From Socrates' perspective, rejection of anti-decaying is a consequence of the principle that we should not harm anyone in any case for any reason. In the speech of the laws, only anti-decaying against legal authority is condemned. In other words, in the second part of the Crito, anti-decaying is condemned by those who harmed first and should suffer retaliation in case, but remain unpunished as a result of their higher social and institutional position. The law, that is to say, must suffer no harm from the citizen, not even if it has harmed them by a just or even an unjust verdict, as a father cannot be punished by the child he has punished, or the master by a maltreated slave. Apparently, the laws accept the possibility of being persuaded, i.e., they are ready or they seem ready to engage in dialogue, as if they wanted to point out that Socrates is guilty of not even attempting to persuade them. Therefore, he should obey, which he refuses to do. According to this disjunctive logical structure I have tried to identify, obeying the laws, keeping silent, or leaving Athens are not distinct logical situations, but different ways of describing the disappearance of the losing opinion, as Socrates asked Crito to do. Either you persuade me or you keep silent. From this point of view, Even Socrates' death is a variant of the silence the losing opinion must keep. Socrates fails to persuade, yet he fails to obey too. He neither keeps silent nor leaves. He has chosen a fourth option, a dramatic one, for himself and faces death. The difference between the variants is just a practical one. The view that the losing opinion should disappear and be reduced to silence brings us to consider one last point, destruction of the law. Such destruction is explicitly regarded as the consequence of Socrates' flight. By contrast, the possibility that the law is destroyed by persuasion is not expressly mentioned. However, in my view, this kind of destruction exists and derives from what we said about the alternative between being able to persuade and succumbing. The fact that the laws accept to be persuaded means that they have an analogous nature to opinion, for only as such could they be subjected to exitazin and elenkos, from which they can emerge either as stronger, thanks to homologia founded on the best argument, not acquiescence, or as losing, hence presumably destined to be replaced by other laws. Persuasion between individuals, so to speak, has significant and drastic consequences on opinions, not on those engaging in dialogue. Socrates' interlocutors at most fall silent. In the case of a dialogue with institutions, things are completely different, as the laws are both a contracting party in the agreement whereby they claim unconditional obedience and the object and the content of an opinion that succumbs and disappears if it is refuted. Destruction of the laws, then, can be understood in two ways, just as there are two meanings of law. There is destruction as injury to the form of law, i.e. lawfulness. By fleeing, Socrates injures the right of the law to be obeyed, hence the right of the police to be served and saved. But there is also destruction produced by persuasion, which in my view is more problematic, for if such persuasion occurs, the law will have to be replaced. If my discussion thus far is correct, or at least plausible, we can rapidly draw some conclusion about both the concept of nomos of the historical Socrates and the later development of this concept in Plato's thinking. Some important scholars, such as Gregory Lestos and Richard Kraut, hold that the content of the speech of the laws expresses the views of Socrates, or that the latter, when he refuses to flee in order to avoid harming the laws of the state, acts in accordance with his principle, which include faithfulness to the ruling institutions. As a result, Socrates has occasionally been regarded as more or less enthusiastically committed to some form of authoritarianism. In my view, the speech of the laws does not reflect Socrates' opinion, but rather the limit that already the historical Socrates saw as to the possibility of engaging in dialogue with legal institutions, a limit rooted in the twofold nature of nomos as both logos and foundation of the state. Socrates' rejection of flight is certainly a display of his faithfulness to the ruling authority. Generally speaking, it matches Xenophon's description of Socrates and justifies us in attributing it to the historical Socrates, who will not let any subjective and individual opinion escape examination and refutation, but stops before the law, i.e. an opinion whose refutation has destructive consequences. For Socrates does not destroy the law in force, Socrates does not destroy the law in force not only because he refuses to flee, but also because he refuses to subject the law to elenkos. This allows us to regard the Crito as an anticipation of Plato's criticism of written laws, i.e. of the normative and constitutional system that, once it has been given a fixed logical linguistic structure, either can no longer be questioned or, if it is refuted, collapses and brings down all that is founded upon it. As for the Xenophon's testimony regarding the relationship between Socrates and the law, it is worthwhile to dwell on a text, the 4th chapter of the 4th book of the Memorabilia, from which we can obtain some elements for a useful comparison with the Crito. The text is well known, and therefore it will be sufficient to summarize it very briefly. Xenophon immediately declares his apologetic intent, arguing that Socrates is very respectful of the laws and decrees of the magistrates, both in public and private life. This obedience to the laws must not be confused, according to Xenophon, with a passive acquiescence, because Socrates, as some episodes of his life show, defended the laws even when this put him in conflict with the major deliberative bodies of Athens. Xenophon clearly alludes to the well-known episode to which Plato's Apology also refers, that of the trial of the generals of the Battle of the Arginusae and the case of Leon of Salamis. Even during his trial, Socrates never resorted to a type of defense aimed at moving jurors, because these rhetoric strategies of defense were forbidden by the laws of Athens. But it is above all the Xenophon's account of the dialogue between Socrates and Hippias that illustrates the way in which Socrates seems to have interpreted his relationship with the laws of the state. During this dialogue, Socrates, more than once, declares that justice and just are the same thing as legality. Nomimon is the same as dikaion. It is perhaps worth noting that Socrates' identification of lawful and just occurs only after a very general statement without any explicit reference to the notion of law, according to which, I quote, "to abstain from what is unjust is just," 4:11. Being Hippias dissatisfied with such a negative definition, a definition telling what just is not, Socrates replies, I quote, "Well, I thought that unwillingness to do injustice, to me telein adikein, was sufficient proof of justice. But if you don't think so, see whether you like it is better. I say that what is lawful is just," end of quote. The sentence of to me telein adikein, in my opinion, is the echo, to a certain extent, a simplified form of the more demanding Socratic proposition that we find in the Crito, as well as later in Republic, according to which one should not harm anyone in any case. Indeed, this unwillingness to do injustice reveals intentionality, a practical and programmatic principle which, in its general negative character, can be interpreted as meaning that being just means not doing harm to anyone, in any case, not even to enemies, and not even for retaliation. Only after did Socrates specify that being just coincides with observing the laws. First of all, the laws of the state, which are the provisions on what to do and what not to do, that all citizens have agreed and established in writing, a grapsanton. But Hippias raises another question. How can justice be defined in terms of obedience to the laws of the state, which are often modified and abolished by those same citizens who sanction them? Autoi, oi, temenoi, apodokimasantes, metatitentai, paragraph 14. I would like to draw attention to the possibility of the abolition of laws, an abolition to which the verb apodokimazo refers, which is equivalent to the disappearance of a normative principle of a practical opinion when this is no longer shared by those who previously supported it. Socrates' answer to the difficulty raised by Hippias is arranged into 3 arguments. In the first place, the fact that a norm can be changed does not relieve the obligation to observe it as long as it is in force. Secondly, and this is the most important reply, since the laws are the result of an agreement of the citizens, obedience to the laws is the primary condition of the reliability of any single citizen. In other words, regardless of the content of this or that law, the observance of the laws by all citizens is the basis of the Homologia, and no state is happy and stable without Homologia. Citizens may have different opinions on different matters, but they have the duty to observe the laws, i.e., that pact of loyalty established with the community, because everyone must be able to count on this loyalty. Finally, Socrates mentions the divine laws that are not written, which might be meant as a reply to the clarification of Hippias, who spoke of the laws of the state as laws established in writing and nonetheless changeable and refutable. Nomos, for Xenophon, Socrates, therefore, is as much a human law, the result of an agreement that can also fail, as the divine law that cannot be abolished. Here too, it is worth noting that the main object of the divine law is procreation, and therefore, indirectly, family and marriage, on which the speech of the laws in the Crito does insist. There is a common ground between the Crito and this chapter of the Memorabilia, a ground providing elements to reconstruct in a plausible, if not a certain way, a reasoning of the historical Socrates on how to understand the relationship between the individual and the political law. Compliance with the current political laws is a principle of a formal guarantee of justice, not necessarily adherence to any particular normative content. This seems to me to emerge from both the Memorabilia and the Crito, that loyalty to the prescriptions of the laws, including judicial verdicts, and perhaps even the provisions that may appear after examination unjust, is a duty as long as those provisions are in force. The stability of the political community is based on this loyalty. It seems to me also that the concept of homologia that Xenophon attributes to Socrates is in part contiguous to the homologia we encounter in the Crito, and in part something different. Perhaps we could say that the homologia Xenophon talks about in this chapter takes on 2 of the meanings that we can attribute to the homologia that we find in the Crito, and precisely the meaning of agreement between several persons or deliberating subjects that is established at a given moment, and the conformity of the action with the agreed opinion. Xenophon does not feel the need to establish a consistency of opinions over time, and above all, a consistency which remains even after the opinions have been critically examined by the Logos. Finally, Xenophon's reference to the writing of laws and the existence of unwritten laws is worthy of interest. Obviously, we know that the verb apographo in classical Greek was a legal term that indicated the public registration of an act, precisely a law or decree, as well as a thing or a person on a list, for example, an asset or a political candidacy. In this context, however, we must observe that Hippias emphasizes the changeability and caducity of laws in the face of a custom, that of transcribing them, the main purpose of which was to make the law stable and appealable by every citizen. The attitude of the mature Plato towards the written law, the written law is also well known. In the Politicos 293c, 296a, Plato claims that the written law is seriously disappointing because of its generality with respect to different situations and human characters, and because of its fixity with respect to changing circumstances. This is why Plato sanctions the superiority of the anerarchikos, that is, of political science with respect to the written law. This aspect does not appear already in the Crito. Then, what I would like to propose is that this dialogue has an aporetic character, i.e., a programmatically not decisive and not positive character, because it aims at problematizing the constant commitment of exetazing logon and logon didonai when these intellectual strategies are applied on the foundations of the political constitution and associated life. Thank you very much for your patience.
Okay, I'll applaud as usual on behalf of everyone who's muted. For discussion, I'll moderate the discussion. As those of you who've been to these before know, the process that we use is to raise your hand. And you do that by going to the bottom all the way to the reactions button. And at the bottom, you click it, and at the bottom is a button for raising hand. So. Andre Lax.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether you would find useful to distinguish between. I think you did actually. It's a reformulation between the content and the form of the law. You did use the term content at one point, and you may have used form also. And so would you agree? I have two questions. So that's the first one, and the second is linked to that. So would you agree that Plato's view, if you want to call it that way, is that there are two conditions to be a law? A law must have a certain content, and the content of the law is that it must be just, with all what this implies. And a law must correspond to a certain form, and the form in the Crito is that it must be obeyed. And there are various ways to be obeyed. It may be declined in various ways, but just the form of the general argument would be this one. And so the question is, would you agree with this very simple description? And the second question is, do you find in the, because I also think that at the beginning you said that the Crito is not aporetical, and that at the end you did say that it is aporetical, or I may have misheard you. In any way, do you find in the Crito any signal, textual signal, I mean, that Socrates is not endorsing the content of what the laws are saying to him? Because you said, I don't think that it represents Socrates' position. Well, it may be so, but in order to get to this conclusion, there is a whole, let's call it hermeneutical way to travel, because I don't think that you can draw that easily from the Crito itself on the simple reading of it. And that would justify, I think, the description of the dialogue as being aporetical. Aporetical is not a bad thing, it's just something that makes you think. So these were the two questions.
Thank you very much for your questions. The first one, if I got your point, the first question, your first question is about the distinction between the form and content that I underlined, I suppose. I received the impression reading the Crito that also in the light of scholarship, also in the light of some contradiction raised by the scholars between the Crito and other dialogues and other attitudes as emerging, for example, from the apology. I received the impression that one of the focal points of the Crito made by Plato in Plato's picture of Socrates, in Plato's portrait of Socrates in the Crito, one of the focal points is the distinction between attitude of respect, the respect of legality, the respect of lawfulness, meant as a formal point, as a formal character, which consists in obedience of the laws, in order to make safe the state. That is to say, political constitution and political and social community, political cohesion is saved just only by the observance of the laws. This does not mean, in my opinion, I think that Socrates does not, even though insisting on this point, and I think that the laws are summoned in the second half of the dialogue to support the point of, and to reestablish the point of the condemnation to death of Socrates against the Crito suggestion to save, of the flight to save Socrates' life. I think that Socrates summoned the laws exactly in order to distinguish these 2 points, form and content. The form of the law, the form is lawfulness, in respect for the laws, in order to save the state, the political constitution which Socrates himself lives. The content of the law is the normative value, the single normative value of the law. And I'd like to link your second question to the first one. A textual signal about the Socrates attitude to the content of the law, if I got your point.
No, to the content of the discourse of the laws.
The content of this, the content of the discourse of the law. Yes, I think that there's a signal, at least I think I found a textual signal of the fact that Socrates, it's not true that Socrates adheres to the content of the laws, even though he is strongly disposed to obey, to respect the lawfulness as the condition, the essential condition of the safeguarding of the state. I think that rather that in the speech of the laws, there is what seemed to me a small discrepancy. When the laws say at 52a, if I remember well, that Socrates never left Athens when he could leave Athens and go to live somewhere in some other state. For instance, he could leave Athens and to go to Sparta and Crete, etc. And he did not do so. But the laws say Sparta and Crete that use Socrates have very often praised for the goodness of their laws and their political constitutions. In which sense this is to me textual, an important message for us. I think that by this admission, the laws make us to understand that it is not true that Socrates has never questioned the content of the laws. Indeed, he probably appreciated and expressed his approval for normative content and normative values, who he considered better than Athens ones. So I think I remain convinced that in the Crito is established a distinction, but this distinction is not a pacific point, it's a very problematic point. It seems to me that there is two points in the Socrates frame of ideas, which is not contradictory to each other, but they are neither easily compatible with each other. The respect of the law as the condition of the safety of the state, and the discussion, the appreciation, the assessment of the normative content, a normative content which has never been discussed. And as aporetical, it's probably I have expressed myself in a bad way. I said in the beginning that Crito is an aporetical dialogue, in the sense that is deliberately aporetic and problematic dialogue, because the main purpose, Plato's main purpose in writing the Crito is exactly to establish these 2 points, the respect of the form, the respect of lawfulness on the part of Socrates, and the contradiction of Socrates himself with a normative system that cannot correct itself, that cannot be subjected to a critical scrutiny.
Thank you.
Okay, Thomas Sabon.
Thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask you about the end of the dialogue. So 54D 2 to 7, I just put the Greek in the chat. And so in response to Andre's question about evidence for an aporetic or problematical reading, I thought you might have pointed here. So famously, Socrates says that he responds to the speech of the laws as the Corybants seem to hear the music of the flutes. The echo of their words resound in me, and it makes it impossible for me to hear anything else. And then he says that Crito would speak in vain if he was to speak against the speech of the laws. And I've always been puzzled by this, because it seems like it might represent a sort of Platonic hapax, the only instance we have in the corpus of Socrates' rational capacity being entirely, rational capacity to consider other points of view being entirely drowned out by one of the perspectives that he's considering. Or if we focus in on the analogy of the Corybants, we might think that this represents some form of mania, the superseding of his rational capacities by way of some form of divine inspiration, and then we could look to the Phaedrus to try and make sense of what that looks like from a Socratic perspective. But I was wondering how you wanted to read this on the basis of the arguments that you gave us in your paper. Do you want to take the ending as a sort of ironic statement? Do you think that it might indicate the sort of aporetic or problematic response to the law's speech that Andre was just pushing you on? Or if you think that it's non-ironic, and I don't see any explicit indications of Socratic irony here, why should we think that Socrates' response to the law's speech on the basis of this short ending to the dialogue marks some sort of deliberate decision not to elenchize them or anything of the sort, rather than the subordinates of his rational faculties to some form of divine inspiration?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a long question. And as for the analogy, the final analogy with Corybantic hymns, it's a very fascinating metaphor. But I think that there's a typical final Socrates evocation and echo of something which fascinates himself, but it is also, in my opinion, at least I have such an impression, it is also one of the metaphors that Plato attributes to Socrates about sound, about the sound, the voice, the divine mania, the sound, the voice of inner daemon, or something that echoes in the soul of Socrates, and the law itself sounds in the Socrates itself, but I have the impression that there is also a negative point in such a metaphor, in such idea, even though it is really fascinating in positive sense, but there's also a negative point. I mean that the law, as I've tried to explain in my paper, the law in Socrates' eyes is and remains a logos, and an opinion, a proposition, a formulation, an assessment about something that we should do or not should do. And as any proposition, any rational item, it should be subjected to critical scrutiny and to critical examination. But this is not possible because, as in any case, when a proposition is refuted, is subjected to elencos, to examination and refutation, it disappears. So the law is destined to be replaced and to disappear. This is the problem of the Crito, according to me. And I don't know if I've answered sufficiently to your interesting question. But I'd like, if I may, I'd like you to add something about your allusion to ironic sense of the Crito that we can find in the Crito. According to me, it cannot be excluded that Plato wanted to describe and picture the very final moment of life of Socrates, and the final moment of life and reflection of Socrates, also in the light of reputation of his irony. I mean, the situation presented and the picture in the Crito is, at least to say the least, paradoxical. The laws intervene in the dialogue because they are evoked and summoned by Socrates himself in order to support the point of his condemnation to death against Crito's argument, whose purpose is to save Socrates' life. So this is at least a paradoxical situation, but I think there's an ironic strategy, a strategy displayed by Plato, which is both ironic and tragic at the same time. I mean, Socrates once calls the laws to support the point of his condemnation to death. And more precisely, he calls the laws in support of the idea that he himself and Crito himself agree. That is to say, no one must harm anyone in any case. But this no harm, never, no harm to anyone in any case is, in the specific context of the Crito, the object, the definition, it serves as a definition of justice. Socrates begins with a negative definition. Kakos poien and kakurgein is the same as adikein. Therefore, to be just means the same as no harming to anyone. So what is Socrates in this way accepting, refusing Crito's proposal of the flight, which is an illegal act? He proves to act as a just man, as a just citizen. And at the same time, he proves that the laws of Athens are condemning at death a just man. And this is ironical, but in a very serious and great sense, because this strategy does not serve just to Plato, for apologetic purpose, in my opinion, but exactly to establish, to put in light, to clarify the contradiction of Socrates, a man as a Socrates, the man of the philosophical life, the life in discussion as the only life worth to be lived, and this normative system that cannot correct itself. And why a law cannot correct itself? Because when a law is sanctioned, established, written down, and applied to the life of a citizen, this law has, differently from any other opinion, has abandoned the dialectical process, which is a never ongoing process, questioning, answering,
Perhaps
discussion.
we might move on and get another
Okay.
question on the
So-
table. Dan Graham.
Thank you for that very stimulating presentation. I too, I'm going to, have a little problem with taking the argument of the laws as not being Socratic in this way. It seems like what happens here is that the laws personified become the examiner, and we get an elenchus of the position offered by Crito that we should flee from prison and so forth. But we're not able to maintain that position consistently because we end up contradicting ourselves when we do that. Now, it seems to me the obvious, at least one obvious lesson to draw from that is that the laws have reason on their side. And to the extent that they do, that's got to be the position that Socrates is going to accept, because there is no reply, there's no answer, there's no consistent answer to the challenges raised by the laws in, a rational way.
So your point is that the speech of the laws is agreed by Socrates.
It is.
You are saying that the speech of the laws in the final part of the Crito is agreed by Socrates?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not convinced of that exactly because it seems to me, put it in a schematic way, that Socrates says to Crito, well, Crito, you and me agree on such an opinion, on this opinion, so and so, exactly because we have discussed on our own opinion, we examine our opinions, we are seeking for the feeble points, the weaknesses, eliminating the feeble points, and after such an examination, we got homologia, you and me. It seems to me that the laws in their speech in the Crito say the contrary. They say, Socrates, there is homologia between us and you, exactly because you have never left Athens, and that means, in our eyes, in our opinion, that you agree with us. You have always agreed with us. But indeed, the laws themselves say, well, you could try to persuade us. It seems so that Socrates has never attempted to persuade the laws. So in my impression, it might be a mistaken impression, of course. My impression is that the laws invoke a kind of homologia, which is exactly the contrary of that which is called for by Socrates in the first half of the dialogue.
Okay, Matteo.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask you about soul, because I think that it's very interesting that in the Crito, it's indirectly referenced, but the word itself is never used. Suke is never used. And it seems that Socrates is somehow maybe even avoiding the word, but yet trying to indirectly bring it up. And I think that this is quite interesting comparing it with the narrative sequel, the Phaedo, where Suke will be the primary thing that's being talked about. And we also see that Crito there does not really understand the soul concept, and he's obsessed with Socrates' body. And it's at the very end where Socrates calls upon the others there to kind of make Crito understand that Socrates is not his body. And the laws, I know that this is an argument by absence, but the laws never talk about souls either. And it seems that souls are quite important and the bettering of souls to laws in general in other dialogue and in other discussions, and yet the laws don't bring this up. So I think this might be an interesting thing to pursue with your argument.
Yes, I agree with you in observing the question of the distance between the point of view of Crito and Socrates and that of Socrates about the priority of goods and evils, in which also includes soul and body. But okay, I've not made my mind on this aspect, which is a very interesting one. I have the impression, I repeat, I had the impression that Plato, writing the Crito, had a main aim, which is exactly to begin a reflection, a critical reflection on the weaknesses of the law, the intrinsic weakness of the law. And this reflection will conclude with the politicos. So I think that the most important point and the most important focus of the Crito is one related to the normativity and Plato's reflection on normativity. On the other hand, I also think that something can be attributed to the historical Socrates in this case, exactly on the basis of some common grounds that can be found between Crito and Xenophon's Memorabilia, as I tried to describe.
Perhaps I'll interject a question, especially in relation to the normative function of the laws that you talked about and that you ended with your answer to the last question. I wonder, on your view, are the laws portrayed in the Crito as entities that can be unjust? Does it make sense from the point of view of the portrayal in the Crito to say that some laws are unjust?
Yes, I think so. I think that in the frame of mind, in Socrates' frame of ideas and frame of mind, the laws can be unjust, can be wrong, and surely I think that the reader of the Crito is disposed to believe the laws of Athens really unjust, simply for the fact they condemn to death a just man with his Socrates. But in my opinion, this is not the problem. It is not the main problem. The main problem is rather the fact that the content of the law is not subjected to critical examination. If it is, it might be revealed as wrong, and in this case, it collapses, and with the law, it collapses also the state. This is the problem viewed and focused on by Plato, according to me.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any hands up and we're about out of time. So let me thank everyone for coming. And this time there will be a talk 2 weeks from now. Sarah Brody and Barbara Sattler will speak to us on the Protagoras.
Rosalind Weiss had a question, sorry.
Oh, somebody had a question that I didn't notice? Ooh.
It was me.
Okay,
Rosalind.
please, I just overlooked them.
It's just a tiny question. I just am interested in what you think about Socrates' view in the Apology that the law in Athens that limits his trial to a single day is a bad law, and other places have a better law where somebody who's on trial for a capital crime would have a longer time to have a trial. Yet he says, 19 somewhere, the law must be obeyed. So it's an interesting case of, we think of in the Apology, that's the place where he says the law doesn't have to be obeyed, but here's one case where he has a definite bad law that he still thinks needs to be obeyed. Just curious what you think about that.
Yes, thank you for your remark. Yeah, this is a matter of relationship between Apology and Crito. But according to me, apart some particular things and particular question, as the one you correctly remarked, underlined in my examination, it is I focused on the main point of Crito, which is not according to me, between Apology and Crito, there is not a real contradiction, but rather a discontinuity. I would say so, that there is a discontinuity in the case of application law, and also discontinuity in the idea of the respect of lawfulness, because respect of lawfulness is a condition of the safety of the state, even in the case of a bad law, even in the case of an unjust verdict. And it's a very different situation in relation to Apology, in my opinion.
Okay, now I'm going to be cautious. Anyone have a question that I haven't noticed? Apparently not. So thank you all. And the virtual Socrates colloquium will convene again 2 weeks from now.